Go to number 9, which is the Port Future Study. There is no local board input. There are no extraordinary items. There are no notices of motion, which takes us to item 9, Port Future Study. And the principal author is Toby Shepherd, supported by Jacques Victor, who's the General Manager of Strategy and Research. And I will put up the motions and I'll move accordingly so we can see them at the outset. And we may not be able to see them on the screen at one time.
We've got a quorum if people are not sitting at the table.
Yep.
Yeah, you don't have to be sitting.
8.
In the room.
9, okay, good.
But if we could please hurriedly take our seats.
It's not healthy to sit so much.
But it'd also be nice if people were here.
Thank you for
the
pointing that out, though, Councillor Cooper. So I'm just going to scroll through and show you the reds in the recommendations. We'll dwell there. So members, it was assumed within the consensus working group recommendations that mana whenua would be engaged with genuinely, but I brought it up front because it is fundamental engagement. And that need has been expressed by mana whenua members. And you can read that out of the report. And then there has been quite a bit of wordsmithing on this report and recommendations over the last week or so, and the word triggers dropped off. It effectively does mean constraints, but just adding the word in there makes it clear, and it makes the recommendations be read with the language of the report and the consensus working group recommendations. And then there are some additions on recognising, commercial propositions, and in some way that is what the representatives here today were referring to. But just keep in mind that they are only 2 of the 17 participants, and we need to value all of the contributors to this consensus working group recommendations. Again, constraints, triggers, monitoring, that may give rise to a port relocation. I think it's straightforward. So I want to move that, and do I have a second for that?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. And then it's up there, and now I will ask Jacques Victor and then Toby to introduce their report.
Thanks. Thank you, Councillor Darby. What we'll do is Toby will just do a quick run through the main things in the report, might touch on 1 or 2 of the things spoken about by the public input by Shane, and then we'll deal with questions.
Okay, kia ora tātou and tēnā koe, Mr. Chair. So just very quickly to give a run through of the Port Future Study, and yep, we had Shane Vuletich and Julie Stout, who were members of the Consensus Working Group, making submissions as part of their respective organisations previously. So Port Future Study started in 2015. It was a year-long study independent of council. We established a consensus working group that had 16 members, 4 of which were mana whenua, 11 of which were stakeholders from across the community and stakeholder organisations, and the port was also a member of that consensus working group. So you've got that broad breadth that brought a recommendations report to this council at the conclusion of that study in mid-2016. They were tasked with providing recommendations to council, at the time to the Auckland Development Committee, for a long-term strategy. Long-term is really important in this project, or in this piece of work. So we looked at short, medium and long. Short was 0 to 25 years, medium was 25 to 50, and the long term was 50 to 100. So it's really important to realise that the recommendations made for the long-term strategy are in that 50-year plus bracket of time. So that's what we're talking about here. They had a consortium of consultants that supported them in their work and did the technical work, and the consensus working group made a number of findings, and then they made 4 recommendations. So, and those are all contained in the consensus working group report that was presented mid last year. And as Councillor Darby says, the resolutions today and the work going forward all takes its direction from this document. So I believe that starts page 50 or so on today's agenda as an attachment. So just to orient ourselves again, the key finding over the long term, so that's over that 50-year plus horizon, is that Auckland's consented footprint at the waterfront can't accommodate Auckland's long-term freight task.
Wrong.
Given the uncertainty and given the given the broad impact of such a finding, the CWG finds it prudent and recommended doing so to create an option to relocate the port should we need to, in effect, push go on said option. So the CWG found it prudent to prepare for the eventuality of a port relocation because of that uncertainty, and they recommended looking into a alternative location, which was the direction that they gave their consultants, who returned both the Manukau site and the Firth of Thames sites, areas for investigation that the previous speakers mentioned. I'll just make the point that just because some of what I was hearing in the previous discussion might have confused this fact, I think page 52 of your agenda shows the map of long list option sites. So just to be clear, the CWG directed their consultants to take a look at where would be feasible to put a port, and so they looked all the way from Northport right down the east coast to Whakatane. They were also looking on the west coast and looked in the Kaipara right through to Kawhia Harbour. So the broad long list of where we were looking wasn't constrained to Auckland. Through their analysis, the consultants arrived at the Manukau area of investigation and the Firth of Thames area for investigation going forward. So the other reason that the CWG found it prudent to recommend that we create an option to move the port is because of the long lead-in time to do so. In the report, there's talk of a 15 to 20-year window. It could be even longer than that to go about this identification analysis, securing a location, and then the construction, the delivery of a new port. In the consultant's report, under the high growth scenario, Auckland's port on the waterfront is constrained at 2039. So that's effectively at the end of that 20-year window, if you like. So if we continue to grow at a high growth rate, we need a new port. Auckland needs a new port at that 2039 date. And if we assume that the construction and delivery of a new port takes 20 years or so, the identification of a location becomes immediately relevant. So that's the thinking behind the CWG's recommendation. This is a really important point. The CWG is not saying that the port moves by 2039. It's saying there is a scenario where we need one by then, and so it is recommended to go through the process of identifying an alternative location now, in the present. So therefore recommendations I've largely described now. So it was that a relocation option is appropriate, that comprehensive investigation of the identified locations, so that's the Manukau and the Firth of Thames, be further investigated. The third recommendation is the regular monitoring of any relocation triggers, and there's that word again, as Councillor Darby raises, and those are both the necessary move, so around capacity and around throughput, so what can the port handle in its current location, but they're also around what I've called in the report the beneficial move, so where the alternative use of the land at the waterfront might outweigh its use as a port, or in fact that the investment at an alternative location might be more attractive than locating the port at its current location. And the fourth recommendation from the CWG is that subject to a commitment to the location process and the monitoring process and to finding a solution to the near-term berth issue, which is around the cruiser multi-cargo dealt with by this committee through the City Centre Wharf Group. Subject to those three caveats that the port need not expand at its current location. So those are the four recommendations from the consensus working group that were put to Council in July of 2016. So today, what this report does is it fulfills a number of functions. So the first is receiving the consensus working group's report, because in the previous council's term, they saw fit to refer it to this term of council. So the first thing we're doing today is just receiving it. The second action that this report takes is it directs staff to scope what the location investigation process looks like and to scope what the monitoring and relocation triggers process looks like. Those don't have dollars attached to them. The work would be as part of BAU sort of strategic work that we do here at Council. If those resolutions are carried today, the next step is this committee would receive those scopes and therefore have something that, should it deem it appropriate, it can push go on. But what we're asking for today is to receive, or what we're recommending today, is to receive the CWG's report as per the resolutions of last term, and to direct staff to go away and start scoping those processes. I think that's essentially the summary, unless you have anything further to add. I would just stress again that through the work going forward, we take the CWG report as the direction, and it's the information in there surrounding the locations and the monitoring and triggers. That's the information that we would use when drawing up those processes, so to the points that have already been raised today. Thanks very much.
Jacques, do you have anything to add, or should we go to questions?
It's probably easier if we go to questions.
And just before we do that, so I just want to clarify, you said this next stage of work is we're not engaging any capital budgets. These are OPEX budgets that are held within your division, which you were anticipating this work for some time, I think, but it's here now, and so they would be done within your existing budgets.
Yeah, absolutely correct. So it is the next decision that will have financial implications. So when we bring the processes, we would try to extend possible, also bring the costs that were associated with implementing those processes, but that's a next decision that may or may not be taken.
Okay, and I'll just recap, and thank you, Councillor Fletcher, for a question overnight on the expenditure on the Port Future Study. Can you or Mr. Quinn give us an account of what was budgeted for the Port Future Study, what was spent?
I've got that from the team provided to me overnight. So the budget for this was between 1.043 million and 1.057, which allowed for some contingency. The project was delivered on time at 1.057. I've got one number wrong there, but under budget it was between those ranges, and so the team did well to get that there. And I think on time, the consensus process does have its foibles in terms of the time it takes, so to keep that on time was a good outcome.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Quinn. Questions, members? Councillor Fletcher, then Councillor Simpson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question's to Jim Quinn, and I'm just trying to understand strategically. I mean, I understand and was part of the council that commissioned the consensus working group, and thank you for the clarification around the expenditure on that group. So the decision was made to refer to the incoming council, which is us. We're a year into it, so fair enough. It's going to come to this committee. That's the appropriate place. But I'm trying to understand in a governance sense what has been to the forefront of the minds of officers and to what degree that they're wanting to give us a sense of direction. Because whilst you are giving us an understanding that in terms of OPEX and just existing budgets, that's fine, but the implications of this are enormous for Auckland. I think it's really important that any decisions are made based on evidence, and I would say to you that the evidence that I've seen, while we've got high growth at the moment and 2039 Lumith, again, we can see that changing potentially, so we need to go into it very carefully. And the bottom line is that we are not going to be doing this in isolation of central government. So just wanting to know the background, Mr. Quinn, on your involvement with this. You know, you're a lead person in terms of strategy. Can you give us any insight into discussions you might have had with Wellington? I would like, before we make any further progress on this, to understand what we're getting into, because we've got a lot of priorities, particularly in the area of public transport, that we're going to have to fund, and I need to understand your role and the strategic thinking behind it.
So just briefly, I think firstly it's here today because it fits in, as you know, we've been through with all of you over the last 2 or 3 months, all the work on the city centre and waterfront work. And so reviewing all of that and thinking where this fits. The other things, as we mentioned earlier today, that have been emerging, like the America's Cup, how that all stitches together, and the work on cruise. So having worked with you about all of that and where the options are, the key thing now is to stitch this last piece together in terms of where the options are and where they might fall. We also had the political mood, if you like, to move through the election. As you well know, the local body election changed. And so I think that all of those things needed to be stitched together. We haven't talked to Wellington in terms of their overt support for this. I think we know that budgets are tight for us and for all at this time, which is why the recommendations are to scope the next step, which is identifying the right site and then decide what we do about having identified that site. Because I think regardless of, from my perspective right now, strategically, you're going to be talking to Auckland Airport later today. One of the reasons Auckland Airport is able to build its second runway is because somebody many years ago made sure that land was available for that option. So I think the first thing is to decide where the port location should be, and then council can decide what it should do about having made that call, whether we reserve the rights and what process we go through. The final decision on move is one that I think, as the reps say, there will be some commercial input. There will be people interested in being involved commercially that may help us. But as you allude to, there is no doubt cost that will be incumbent on council, but also central government, because wherever a new port site ends up being, there will be landside infrastructure that are more likely to be central government cost.
Did you give consideration to allowing this committee to interrogate some of the information first before working from the assumption that we need to have another stream of work looking at the site? Why I say that is too often we let Wellington off the hook with costs, and yet again we're going out, waving our brave flag, doing work that should be funded, to my mind, by central government. So I've got a concern that before we launch into this, there's quite a lot in this report that I would have liked the opportunity for interrogation of. I'd also liked to have had the opportunity of a working party, because we have a hell of a lot of working parties with the Port of Auckland, to discuss this report. And to the best of my knowledge, we haven't done that yet.
So, two things there. I'm not sure I agree with you that deciding on where the port should move to is something that Wellington would fund. I think that's something, it's our port and we need to make that call, but the consequential effect of that call is where Wellington are involved. So I think we need to do our bit first, so I just the subtlety of that. Sorry, and you are doing a workshop with the Ports of Auckland shortly, early November, and that would be the chance for that discussion to be had. So this is another step of what is, including the central.
I guess it's chicken and egg, you know, maybe we could have had the workshop first, but
Well, we thought about that. The
who's we? You?
yeah, we considered there are we've been working
CEO,
with
you? Who
Oh,
is
well,
we?
The CEO, myself, Dean, and councillors. We've been what we're trying to do is to give you all of the information, and which includes, as I said before, the central wards and the.
Which councillors?
Sorry, well, I've worked with Councillor Darby on the agenda today, so there's no game here. I'm just pointing out.
No,
that,
no, I'm
yeah.
not suggesting there is. I'm just trying to, in a governance sense, understand what is driving this.
All we're trying, well, what we're trying to do is we've reviewed the city centre waterfront. We're now stitching the port to that, bringing through, as council asked for, the port study from last year, which enables us then to take the next steps. As you say, the next thing is to bring the Ports of Auckland to you to round that off and give you the other perspective, assuming you agree with the recs for today. In a future, sometime after that, you will get the recommendation on the process to identify the final site and the budget for that, because these things require deep work. The port study went so far, but to really make that final call will be a deeper job. So we need to think about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, members. Just to remind you that we had information at a planning committee workshop on the 7th of August. We consider this work. We aren't arriving at this business meeting cold. I appreciate that some people can't, for whatever reason, make those workshops, but we did canvass the Port Future Study on the 7th of August, and it was well telegraphed that it was coming from much earlier in the year when we spoke of the various threads that we needed to pull together on the waterfront and the sequencing of those various threads. Councillor Casey, I'll go to you because you had a point of
It's just something
clarification.
that Jim said. Jim, can you just explain to me what you meant about the implications of the change of council? Were you talking about the new mayor being more interested in selling off assets?
So what I said
We've
was
never
that,
had a vote.
no,
We've never
I
had
agree.
a
I
vote.
just said the politics around the profile of the move
Excuse me, I can't hear.
through the election became, the politics around what my point only was that through the election, the port move became something that was discussed in the public. That was all I was saying.
It was discussed by a mayoral
Yeah,
candidate.
no, I agree. Well, no, I think all of them.
How does that
responded.
affect the report?
Nothing, I was just pointing out that was one of the contextual pieces. It didn't affect what we're doing here, sorry.
It's just an odd thing to see.
Okay, I can be odd.
Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suppose as a new councillor, it was nice to actually get that clarification on what the last council had received by way of the Port Future Study. And I suppose the other thing I just really, and I support the recommendations, but it's not going to cost us any money. It takes us to a point. We've spent this money. We need to sort of progress and see what happens next. My point that I'm still not 100% sure on is around the role of government. It is our port, but what actually is, we don't have a government currently, and we will hopefully on Thursday, but there's all sort of, and because we don't know what we don't know, there's all sorts of speculation with regards to potential port sites. So what could go wrong or right with regards to, what is the role of government in this? Can someone clarify that for me, please?
Sorry, I think, there are a range of options in that. Somebody talked earlier about whether there's a national or regional port study done.
That's their decision, isn't it?
That would certainly require them to be involved for that to occur. Certainly in the final decision to relocate the port to a new site, government would have to be involved because a large chunk of the money required would be on landside infrastructure rail, roads and those sorts of things. And that would normally be funded by central government, all or a large part of.
Not.
So it is not something that,
Is there outside all?
that the Auckland Council could embark on and afford to do on their own.
Right,
So that's the
okay.
key issue.
So it's actually quite important that the
Vital.
government, vitally important, yeah, right, got that,
And hence recommendation B1C.
yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, got two questions, and I'd like to know what extent the future port study is taking them into consideration. One is around vehicles, which comprise, according to the study, 45% of imports by tonnes. And my question is around what will be the consequence of the disruption that's underway to vehicle use, and I appreciate that Auckland is an anomaly where we're going to see a substantial reduction in the number of vehicles on the road and conceivably a significant change in ownership of vehicles away from private ownership to alternative forms of ownership. There are many people commentating on this, so I just wonder what that does to the ports in terms of capacity requirements and to what extent it's been taken into account.
I've got all my post-it notes here. So, really good question. The first point I would say, and you know, I'm not the expert on all of this. I'm the council staffer, you know, assigned to this. But I was there through all of the conversations, and of course, you know, read the report a few times. So, but the first thing I would say here is there are incredible amounts of uncertainty. We are talking about 10, 30, 50, 100 years when we're planning the sorts of freight volumes that are going through the port. With respect to your question around how does car ownership impact on, you know, essentially I'm understanding that question as will the number of cars coming across the wharfs decline over time?
Correct.
The key thing to understand there is vehicle ownership per capita. And Auckland is a growing city and a growing region, and in fact the port actually serves wider than what might be understood as our own population. So if we're at 1.6 right now, car ownership is around 0.7, I believe, per capita. We do 250,000 cars or so over the wharfs per year. If we get to 2.5 million, and the other regions are growing as well, as we talk about that long-term time period for this study, even if the per capita ownership of cars does decline, we would anticipate, and there are graphs here within the port report itself, and I can have a chat to you afterwards about where those are and what they show.
I'm looking at them.
Oh, you've got the same thing that I do around.
Assuming so, yes.
Sort of page 85 or so within the consultant's report. So there's some points in there around New Zealand has reasonably high car ownership and per person, and even if that were to decline, the population growth itself continues to drive the growth of cars.
I think my question is around significant disruption that's underway. Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm looking at the report, and my view is that it's inadequate in that respect. So that's one question, and I'd suggest, given that vehicles are 45% of imports, it's a very substantial consideration. The other question that I've got is around sea level rise, and particularly the 1.9 metres that the Ministry for the Environment is now putting forward, and that may well be conservative, and the associated concerns around storm surge and other events that I know overseas ports are now actively taking into consideration. How much has that been factored into this study, given that that is one of the most significant disruptions that is now acknowledged as affecting ports worldwide?
To my knowledge, the sea level rise isn't in the considerations here. This was about how to best accommodate Auckland's freight task over that period, and I think the scope of the work there didn't include the sea level rise, but I will go back and check that for you. Can I just make one comment on the previous question as well? Because you're exactly right to raise that uncertainty, and I think that's why the recommendations for the resolutions here today are around the monitoring and the triggers. So it's vital to check, what is the disruption in the car space as we go forward.
Okay, through you, Mr. Chair, I just put to you that the lack of consideration of climate change, sea level rise, storm surge, other impacts that are acknowledged as impacting on port activities significantly, and these are certainly being taken into account by overseas ports, is a very substantial problem, I think, with this study, as it goes to ports of Auckland, and for that matter, any alternative location.
So it was always intended, just to be clear for you, that that would be factored in to any decision to move, and the science around that would be part of the choice, the risk of where money was invested. So it was less relevant to this study, which was about can the port survive here, and because we need to decide where it goes to. So it will be taken into account in that next phase.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I guess my contention is that it should have been an implicit part of the study. I did raise it. I don't agree with the notion that it's an after. I'd suggest that it predicates much of what we're considering. So that's what I want to put on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. That affects any location, the current location or any future location, because the sea level is going to rise at the same level, subject to storm surge exposure, in whichever location you might be going to. And I'm aware, Toby, can you just go over the consortia of consultants? We had EY, we had EY Tahi for cultural, we had a range that were involved. Can you just remind us of what their areas of input were? We had Black Key on port planning, GHD were the engineers, JLL.
That's right, and JASMAX were also involved. JASMAX were also involved, that's right, yeah, and JAL, yeah.
And the environmental consultants, there was an environmental consultancy, was it eCoast?
They did some review work for us. So Black Key looked at the essentially the port operations and planning side of things, and eCoast helped us with the could it be feasible to dredge the Manukau Harbour and use a West Coast port. Yeah, for the life of me, I can't remember whether or not the sea level rise featured in our multi-criteria analysis of each site.
I haven't seen it.
Sort of desperately searching for it here for you now.
I haven't seen it.
So I'll take a look. I'll have a think and I'll get back to you.
And Councillor Walker, you have heard that that is part of the next stage.
Yeah.
You've heard that from both staff members. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Three questions. First question's just for clarification. The way I'm reading these recommendations is that we are shortlisting just down to 2 ports to be incorporated, for the next step, where in Shane's presentation earlier today, they mentioned Northport and Tauranga as well. So am I reading that correctly? We're limiting it just down to those. I mean, you did refer us to, that map where all were looked at, and it's been shortlisted down to those 2, but just taking on some fresh information today, am I reading that correctly? We're just limiting it to those 2 ports.
So a couple of things there. The first to note that, so BI is, as you say, Manukau and Firth of Thames, but then, and I know it's convoluted, but BIA is noting that there would be scoping for any alternative, sensible alternative options within that. So I think, backing up a step, the Port Future study took a year, employed consultants, started with a really long list, boiled that down from what would be physically feasible to what we think might actually work as a site for further investigation, and arrived at these 2 options. Going forward, you want to try and nut those out and see if you can actually find something that really works. But in that process, it would be silly, I think, to limit a future process to only those 2 if, another option did arise. So we don't see that as being limited to just those 2. Is that clear? Or
yeah, no, that is clear. Yep, thank you. Second question, Mr. Chair. Shane also mentioned in his report the option of the sale of the business and keeping the land, and perhaps the importance in doing that process of whoever a potential new owner might be, picking up some of the costs of a potential relocation. And I've already picked up these different concerns from different councillors around the sale of that asset. So, and can you just clarify for me, reading the report, I can't see that option in here, and it isn't part of the reference material either. So is that excluded in the study, or the process, looking at the process?
I think it's better if I pick up that one
Right,
for
Jim,
you,
thanks.
if that's okay, Chair.
Yes.
The sale, as the presentation said, would be a sale of the operating business if that was to occur. For council to extract its best value from that concept, the tenure of the location would be a critical part of the valuation. So there's quite even the presentation earlier today highlights, because they say giving a tenure of more than 15 years would be a bad outcome from their perspective. So there's a circular argument which we would need to work through before we went anywhere. Anybody wanting to invest in the operating business, tenure's a vital piece of how they'd value it, and the risk of any cost they'd have to bear to move, which if they aren't part of that would be a big issue. So that issue is parked from our perspective until we resolve, have enough evidence or enough data to be able to put a proposition to somebody with all of those pieces solved. Otherwise, we just value the asset effectively.
Oh, thank you for that answer, Mr. Quinn. I think it also your answer to Councillor Fletcher was helpful in terms of just the order we're doing this in. And finally, I guess with the relocation, there's the opportunity, just reading perhaps a little bit deeper into the report, and I might be on the wrong track here, the opportunity for regional growth opportunities, i.e. more housing along trunk lines, etc. Again, is that something that's going to fall into this next phase, or is it another phase after what we're about to look at or approve today? Is it part of the consideration? I didn't get that feeling from the report.
In terms of what? The development of housing along...
Well, yeah, just it opens up, perhaps, opportunity to open up new land.
That would be a following piece, not a input to this piece. It may be a value that if you saw it, you may want to value, and so we'd deal with that at the time, but it's not an intended part of the next phase.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Can I just be really clear that this report has no assumptions, is making no consideration, and it's not on our radar, the possible disposal of any part of the port interest, our port interest in the ports of Auckland. So we did hear Shane refer to that, and you're referring to a slide, Councillor Sayers. I think it's really important that we make this clear. That is the presentation of 2 of 17 consensus working group members. It is not contained within the body of their recommendations in the consensus working group report, the Port Future Study report. They did convey that here today. That is their personal view. Those 2 organisations, I think, those 2 people out of 17. It's not for our discussion here today, and it is definitely not something that is remotely on my personal radar as chair, or I'm hearing the council as a whole at this stage. We are just talking about the recommendations that are coming through from the Port Future Study.
Mr. Chair, I guess the reason why I've perhaps focused on that a little bit more intently is, perhaps as a new councillor, not being early in the process, I have read the other reports, the EY reports and Ernest Young reports as well. So I'm wondering how, and EY was one of the consultancies, so there might be some confusion on my behalf there, if you're able to clarify that, because they have presented those reports to council. Yeah, so let's just be clear on EY's role in forming this report and EY's role in other reports that are separate to this report. Yes, can you just clarify, even though with the same company, I think it's important that it's clarified.
They're quite different things. One was their role in this as one of the lead consultants. The report you're referring to is the financial options report, which was around how can council derive value from its assets in other ways. They're quite separate bits of work, other than the port is mentioned in both. So, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
And the answer I gave you before around the tenure and all of those things affects that second piece of work a lot.
Thank you. Councillor Clough?
Yes, I have another amendment which I'm quite happy to be incorporated into this if the Chair and Mr Quinn are happy with, and Ms Cooper, which is to have C say the process is to include engagement with mana whenua full stop, and then either a new B or a D which would say the process is to include engagement and advocacy to central government on an Upper North Island port study.
Okay, can we just have the words up here at the desk and then we'll have a look at them and take those into consideration. We'll carry on with the questions, Councillor Clough, and we'll come back to that. We'll just work with them first. Councillor Hills?
Thank you, Chair. It's probably more of a question. How does this fit in or weave in with the America's Cup as well? Obviously, you know my view on the Halsey Street extension, but if this is obviously long term, but then how does it weave in with the work that's being done on what possibilities or uses that we can use for America's Cup in the port area rather than building more infrastructure that we would in turn may not need future? Is that a question for Jim or?
No, I can answer that.
Oh, sorry.
I think the short answer is it doesn't. There is no particular link. This really is looking at the long term, so it's looking at a location and it's looking at the triggers. The shorter to medium that you are talking about is the berth issue and the cruise issue. That's the link. And that process does not sit within the recommendations here. That sits with the work being done by the city centre and waterfront. So there's quite a separate process that would take care of that.
But so there's no link with potentially building a $200 million wharf over here when we might have space over here?
No, in that sense there is.
50 years away.
But it is that process that sits outside of this that will have to take that into account. So in terms of the recommendations here, there is no link because it is looking at the location and the triggers. It doesn't look in any sense about the shorter term needs or what might be going on in the waterfront.
Strategy. Okay, thank you. Councillor Casey again.
Yeah, just a couple of clarification questions. I'm puzzled a wee bit by that presentation we had. In the interest of balance, where is the alternative presentation? If that was three individuals who are gung-ho about selling the port, where's the alternative? Like, we wouldn't have... I'm asking you as chair, where the alternative presentation is that would advocate for keeping the port as a valuable strategic asset?
Look, the public forum can be used like that. We could have had others that could have identified the fact that there was a report on their agenda, and I would have been bound by the rules to consider their application to speak in the public forum as well. That could have been from mana whenua, that could have been from business, that could have been from ordinary citizens who weren't part of the consensus working group. Those parties saw that the report was on our agenda and responded. I received an email from Mr. Vuletic on, I think it was Sunday afternoon. I think I saw it Sunday evening.
Sorry to continue this conversation, but isn't it incumbent upon the chair to provide balance? That was a political presentation about selling the Port of Auckland.
Neither did I seek a political balance to the submission of the Tree Council from those that might want to protect, I don't know, private property rights. It's not my task as chair to arrange a balance in the public forum. it's my job to respond to the standing orders that show the way how these meetings are run, and I did.
Accept your explanation for that, Mr. Chairman. My second question relates to the word relocation and its alternative meanings. So how can you relocate a port without selling it?
Well, we own the land, don't
Well,
we?
I don't have the answer to that.
So you
So
can,
it's easy to say relocate the port, but what you're actually doing is selling the business of the port.
no, you've got the option of, from the right way to explain this, we own the port and we've just decided it's going to be somewhere else.
Yeah, but how can you do that without selling it?
What? The port's,
Business of the port.
so the port's an operating business, and what we would be doing if the decision in time is only to relocate, is to take the business we own and put it somewhere else. So that's all it is. It's not a sale, but you would need to acquire the location you're going to put it under, and you have freed up the location it was in. So it's no different to when council used to be in the Civic building here and has moved to 135 Albert Street. We didn't sell council to do that. We just moved the people.
Okay, so that was a specific presentation on selling the port that we had this morning. My third question, I might stop there.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can I just want to jump in there. The CWG used really specific language, and they did that on purpose. And so I just want to clarify, the CWG did not recommend that the port must move. They did not recommend
I'm very
that at all.
confused then, because I was listening to that presentation
that's
this morning,
why
and I
I-
just wonder why it was there, if that's not the recommendation that's...
That's why I feel I need to explain this a bit. So the CWG does not recommend outright the port has to move, not whatsoever, because of all kinds of reasons. We are talking really long term. There are so many variables. No one can decide today whether any of those are going to be triggered. So what the CWG recommends is, what they came to, the conclusion they came to is, it is very unlikely that the port would be able to continue its task on the current footprint. So at some point, the volumes are just going to get too big to handle on that current footprint. I beg your pardon?
Based on current consumption and use.
Absolutely. And they looked at all kinds of new technologies. What happens with 3D printing? To what degree would that reduce? What happens if we import less cars? But a lot of that stuff is so hard to predict. So they essentially said, based on taking all of that into account and where we are, the extent we can see into the future, it seems unlikely that Auckland's total freight task would be able to be accommodated on the current footprint. That was the first thing they said. Then they said, we also take it that the sentiment of Auckland seems to be that there should not be any further extension into the harbour. So you can't increase the footprint. So therefore we have a problem. But they can't guarantee that the volumes are going to get to the point where it can't be accommodated on the footprint. And so that's where the next two recommendations come in. All they are saying is to be prudent in case that happens. And because it is such a big thing and it takes so long to move a port, we need to do two things. We need to find a location, alternative location, in case it is needed. But it is not saying that we need to move. It is only in case it's needed, then you have the alternative location. The second recommendation is, what you need to do is you need to monitor all of this, because the stuff, as Councillor Fletcher says, and as Councillor Walker said, may not play out this way in the future. So you really need to monitor it to see if it does actually play out that way, because it may be that none of this is needed because the volume simply didn't increase at the same rate. And so you can't just go, yep, it has to move. You need to understand whether it is needed. So it then also says there are two types of needs. The one is the capacity. The volumes simply get too big for the port. Then you have no alternative. You have to find another solution to this, which might be a number of different things. The other kind of need is the need of people of Auckland. It isn't just about capacity. There might be other needs where the land is more valuable, the freight task going past communities living there might just be too much for them. So that's what we call the beneficial triggers. So two kinds, the capacity, you're full, or there are other things that have become more important. It's recommended that both of those get monitored so that you can make a decision informed, that you have facts that you base it on, because you do not know what the future holds. That's really what it comes down to. So we think there is likely to be a problem in the future, but we can't guarantee it. So therefore, the prudent thing to do is find a location in case you need it. Doesn't mean you go there, in case you need it. And second, make sure you understand what is actually happening. So when you need to make the decision, you are informed. That's essentially what the CWG said.
Thank you. Councillor Mikely.
I wasn't going to ask a question, Mr. Chair, but I would like to ask the officers, did the future port study conclude that, that the ports of Auckland, in its present footprint, cannot accommodate the future freight task of Auckland, or did it rather say it can accommodate 3 times the present level of freight on its present footprint? So rather than repeatedly stating to the governing body that the ports of Auckland cannot accommodate the future freight task, you should be saying, or should you not, that it can accommodate the vast bulk of it out into 50 years, given how long it's taken to reach 1 million TEUs, the fact that the ports of Auckland could accommodate 3 million TEUs, you're not making this clear at all. You're actually stating that at a certain stage, the freight throughput will grow to such an extent that almost as if the port will burst, and that will be the end of it. That is not. The port can accommodate 3 million TEUs indefinitely, which is way more than it accommodates now. You're not making that clear, and I'm finding that increasingly irritating, because we're working on a false assumption here.
So that's a question. You said I'd like to ask the officers, so let's give the officers the opportunity to reply. And Councillor Lee referred to the container volumes, but there are 2 parts to the port. There's the multi-cargo vehicles and the container volumes. So in your reply, can you address both parts, please?
I'll reply some of it, and then Toby will actually quote some of the wording in the CWG report. Absolutely correct, Councillor Lee. What the study says is up to about 3 million. So at the moment we're doing about 1 million. So up to around 3 million. Yes, that can be accommodated on the current footprint. There's also all kinds of efficiencies that the port, so if you take that into account over time, the efficiency gains that the port makes, yes, it can take up to 3 million. The question is, what happens when it goes past 3 million? This is a long-term study, and so it is looking at the 50 to 100 years, and that's what they were asked to do. One can't work on the assumption that Auckland's TEU demand would never go over 3 million. And I suppose that's where the CWG is saying, in case that does, and they're not guaranteeing that it will, but in case that does, it would just be prudent to allow yourself other options.
For the extra, for the stuff over 3 million.
Yeah.
You're suggesting that there won't be any freight task at the Port of Auckland at a certain stage. That is ridiculous.
Point of order, he is not suggesting that at all, and this is an officer's
Thank you.
indicating what's in the
Again,
report.
Not a point of order.
That's not a point of order.
Whatever.
It's a political debate.
Order, please.
They're having a go at the staff.
Toby and Jacques, could you continue with your reply to that request? You've covered the container growth. Can you compare that with the growth of the multi-cargo vehicles and also reference, I think it's a recommendation that those two parts of the port activity are not decoupled?
Yeah, so look, okay, this is it's a really big issue and there's lots of integrated parts, and what I'm hearing Councillor Lee say, I completely agree with. It's in the report. It says that it looks like the current consented footprint of the port, along with some operational efficiencies, stacking things higher, etc.
Having women as straddle carriers, drivers.
Order, please. Please, let the officers finish.
Can move the capacity of the current port from about 1 million containers a year to 3 million containers a year over the next however long that takes us to get to 3 million. So first point, the CWG is not saying we definitely will get to the 3 million TEU, but they are saying that based on the EY's findings, and the words they use in the report are, based on EY's findings, the existing port will not be able to accommodate the long-term freight task and crews on the current footprint.
That's not correct.
So
It won't be able to
Councillor Lee, you might have
process all of it, but 3 million of it.
You might have a different point of view.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, of course.
You need to make that clear because you.
Order, please. Councillor Lee, you
so-
might have a different point of view, but you've asked a question and you're getting official advice.
Yes,
Based on the findings of the report.
And I'm right, aren't I?
No, please.
So again, there's a number of things going on here. So I think what I think I'm hearing from you is that we're trying to say that, well, I'm not trying to say anything, I'm just reporting the report. That the port can only take 3 million and then it stops working. And if container growth were to get to 4 million, I think I'm hearing you suggest, well, you just relocate the 1 million extra, right? And, you know, in terms of the geometry or the sort of the physics of that, you're correct. The port can accommodate, and EY finds that through the efficiencies from the current footprint, they can move from somewhere around 1 million today to somewhere around 3 million. The consensus working group, through their own discussion and work, and through the technical work done through the consortium, looked at not just that proxy for capacity, which you're using, which is the container growth. They also looked at the cars, which is your point, Councillor Darby. Cars are at a point of constraint now, and in the coming years, we need to find a solution at the port to accommodate the growing number of cars coming across the wharfs. So that's point number one, that it's not just the containers as a proxy for port capacity that we need to be concerned with. But I do agree with you, there's the 3 million figure in there. The second point I'd make is the consensus working group is not solely concerned with the capacity at the current site and then growth of freight up to an agreed capacity, and then from that point we must move the port. They also looked at, so the three issues were berth, capacity and traffic. And so those are some other criteria or points of analysis that need to be thought through when we imagine a port that is somewhere in the region of 3 times bigger in terms of throughput, 3 times bigger than today. So that's that the berths that we have available to us must function at that size, and then of course that we've got something like triple the number of trucks on the road or triple the number of freight carts on our rail lines. So there are other issues at play, and again, you know, I urge you read the report. I'm doing a poor job of summarising it on the fly. And I think that idea that it's not all about capacity, we've tried to explain that in the officer's report with the beneficial and necessary move. Necessary describes that capacity problem, and necessary might not be the best word, it's just what I've used there to say once we reach capacity, that port can no longer take additional freight. On the beneficial side, and again, might not be the best word, what we've tried to do there, and I think this is what Shane and Julie and Michael were speaking to this morning as part of their completely separate public input. I just found out about that this morning. they're saying, look, there is there's another factor here. It's not just capacity and freight and throughput. It might be that there is a more desirable alternative at the current site. So it's very difficult to just pick one part of this project. And again, I realise I'm rambling on, but it's integrated. And the CWG, as a collection of 16 individuals, 4 mana whenua, the port, stakeholders, this is what they came to. This is their consensus.
Can I ask you, what is the viable alternative at that site?
What is the what? Oh, at the current site? So the CWG doesn't go into what alternative land uses might be, but it, you could hypothesise that that might be.
I think this is quite important, isn't it?
What was that, sorry?
I think it's very important in terms of proposed alternative uses of that site.
Completely. And so again, to the resolutions and recommendations for today,
and the concerns of vested interest.
Sorry, I just finished. So that you would need to set up a monitoring and sort of trigger regime to decide, what is it that you think is appropriate in terms of defining a more beneficial alternative at the current site. Would that be, as I believe sort of Shane was suggesting in his presentation, would that be simply rates, revenue, and sort of GDP production from businesses located there, or might it be other things, amenity, noise reduction, etc. So that's part of the process going forward. And
Part of the next stage. Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, just got a question around cars, and I've read the report. Given that it mentions on page 107 that at times cars utilise 90% of the terminal footprint, and it acknowledges on page 119 the option of not having cars but shifting cars elsewhere, and the disruption that's imminent from self-drive cars, that is, cars that will be able to park closer but also be able to be moved off without the need for humans. To what extent have those things been factored into the port study, given the magnitude of that elephant in the room, and that is cars?
Electric cars will still have to be delivered.
An exact answer?
Just a minute.
Well, so Councillor Walker, that was a massive study. I do not know the exact answers to all of the detail of that. What I do know is that there was a rigorous analysis of all the stuff. People, the consultants and the CWG took things into account to the extent that it is possible today, including some future projections and assumptions that they made. So to that extent, they would have taken that into account. Exactly how they did that and to what numbers, I just don't know. I will have to go and study the report again, and I just can't remember.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I've read the report, I've read the peer reviews that go to this, so I understand the answer in part, and my concern is that it is not adequately addressed given the substantial nature of that issue, and I repeat, 90% of terminal capacity at times. That's massive. Effectively, the port is a car park.
It's good that you recognise that. So that was addressed in the work, and that will be further addressed in the next tranche of work. Councillor Watson.
No, it's been on, but I would like to speak when that opportunity comes.
Councillor Simpson? Councillor Watson, we have been taking speaking turns throughout, so if you'd like to speak now, or shall I take
a question?
Councillor Simpson?
No, I'm
Councillor Simpson, back to you, Councillor Watson.
Okay, so we can speak to the side.
Yes, it's been moved and seconded. Once it's moved and seconded, the speaking turns are recorded.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess just at the outset, I would just like to contrast the way we're approaching this with with what happened in New South Wales. And I know that I did read it in one of the parts where there in the report where reference was made to what they did in Sydney, moving to Port Botany, a relocation or building a new facilities, and then increasing them out there. But in that instance, that was pushed by the government. They had the New South Wales Maritime Services Board was driving it, and then the state government picked it up, which is the opposite, seems to me, where we're kind of pushing it, and the government, we are going to we are going to approach them and engage with them. But this is really quite different from the way things panned out in New South Wales. And they've got 6 ports, all of whom have grown, have diversified, have increased their capacity. So, in my layman's understanding of this, you would think, well, if the northern part of the North Island is growing in the way it is, then the answer might not be in relocating or moving Auckland, is just transferring some of the activity somewhere else. It's not quite the doom and gloom scenario that's been painted before us. And that would seem to me to be an entirely practical view. I don't know if it's implicit in the recommendations, Jack, or not, that there might be some intermediary solution here. I'm hoping it is in the options where we look at what's happening in Auckland, what Auckland can contain, and it might involve something going to Northport or something else going down to ports of Tauranga if needs be. I mean, that would seem to me to make more sense, because what does certainly emerge from a reading of the report and other commentators is the value of the port to Auckland. I mean, that's stated in terms of our income, $50, $60 million each year. The cruise ships increase, like $1.5 million each for every day they spend in the city. Most of the cargo in Auckland's destined for Auckland, $250,000 of cars. One of the commentators reckoned there was 160,000 people employed in Auckland and port-related industries. So that's a massive benefit, whatever way you like to look at, to having that at the port in Auckland as it works. And that hasn't emerged at all from some of the commentaries that we've heard today. On the other hand, Mr. Chair, and I know this will definitely come out in any subsequent work, are the options that are getting put up. And people are being quite scathing in terms of Manukau and the Thames, and it might, when it's all said and done, might not take too long to discount them. They might not be options at all, in which case we're back to the starting point that I've just referred to. Councillor Walker referred to the climate change as being an important consideration, and it actually is mentioned in passing in the Port Future study, and really just reiterates what he was saying, how weather might mean that the port could be closed occasionally if they were coming in through the west coast, and that is very uncertain in terms of adverse weather that coming about as a consequence of climate change. So it has been recognised, even though it wasn't really expanded upon. So I guess what I'm saying when it's all said and done, Mr. Chair, is that there is no need to rush here, despite what we're hearing from some of the people, that we have to weigh up very carefully, and I would suggest again, I know Councillor Fletcher said that this should really be getting driven by the central government. I would just say I, for one, would be loath to see our ports of Auckland dismissed so summarily as is happening in some cases. We talked about the value of the land. No one's really mentioned what greater value might be going on that. Is it, for instance, a greater value in a whole lot of expensive apartments that wealthy people live in? I mean, is that what we're talking with, a little bit of public space around there outside? To me, that might be an economic value that is calculated, but it's not really a big value to the people of Auckland. That hasn't been mentioned at all. So I would just say, take it easy, perhaps look more at the pragmatic option of allowing Auckland Port to confront whatever uncertainties be, whether they be declining car numbers, whether it be increased efficiency. I remember 18 months ago we were getting told by Ports of Auckland they couldn't do anything with the cars. They threw their hands up in the air and said, we need to extend out from Bledisloe because this is all we can do. Now we're talking about sensitive design of car park, just like that, which we all knew could happen anyway. So there is a lot of uncertainty here. And I just don't want us to underestimate the value of our port to our city.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Simpson.
No, I've spoken to me.
Councillor Wayne Walker again.
So I'm assuming we're into debate now, Mr.
We've
Chair,
been in
because
debate for some time and
want-
you've already debated.
I have not. I've asked questions. So I really want to pick up on the issues that Councillor Watson has raised that go to the ball being in the government's court. My concern is, given the critical need for the government, a government, to address the issue of both Ports of Auckland and Tauranga and Northport, and I'm assuming that that's an absolute no-brainer, it concerns me that we would do further work and use scarce resources on our part until that work has been done. In my opinion, frankly, we should use some leverage and say to the government, well, look, we don't want to do any further work until you've done your work, because your work predicates ours. So while I see some recommendations here, my huge concern is around timing and around resources.
Just vote for D.
Yep. And I certainly advocate for D, and that needs to happen first. And that is not obvious in those recommendations. I'm happy to move something to that effect with your leave, Mr. Chair.
It's already been included. Councillor Clough has proposed that, and it's up there now. And
I understand that it's up there, but the timing is not up there, Mr. Chair, and that is what concerns me.
The Deputy, Councillor Cooper has also accepted that inclusion, so it's up there under our names.
I think it's intrinsic in there that we get on with it.
It is, absolutely.
That they get on with it, that is the government.
No,
and
we get on with with D.
Thank you. Councillor Cashman?
Sorry, C and D.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think it's very easy to get tangled up in the details here when the truth, all we're doing is taking a precautionary approach to what is a very serious issue. The working group, the Consensus Working Party, came to some conclusions and estimations about, is the date 2039 when decisions have to be made. So you all know, if I went to Singapore and spoke to the ports, and they're shifting their port for the second time, and they're taking 20 to 25 years to do it in stages. So we're talking here enormous timeframes, and the amount of change we're going to see in our society will be incredible. And we'll still have mobility, something arriving on the port somehow. We'll still be importing and exporting materials, goods. We'll still need a port, but will it be in its current format, or the container cranes are all going to be moved by robots, apparently shortly anyway. So that sort of technological advancement, as we're seeing in Hamburg and Antwerp, is already underway around the world. So this precautionary approach, this scoping, to me is eminently sensible. We're not saying we're going to shift the port in 2039. We're not saying we're going to shift the port necessarily at all. We're saying let's double check the work, let's get our ducks lined up, and let's get a precautionary approach about where potentially a future site could be and what the triggers may be around an eventual move, if there ever is one. And those triggers could be anything from technology change to climate change to social change. And let's take into account the environment and the social implications of these things. And we are just moving through this in a logical, calculated and conservative manner to protect the future of the port industry for this city. And I think that's the important part. The precautionary approach is the sensible pathway.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important matter for the governing body. The governing body not only has political responsibility in representing the communities who vote for us, but we also have regional, economic and commercial responsibilities in the sense that we represent the shareholders of the ports of Auckland in its widest sense. The port is, in its ultimate sense, owned by the people of Auckland, and we represent those people, and hopefully we represent the best interests of those people. The port is not only a major strategic economic asset for New Zealand, and for Auckland, but it is also commercially extremely valuable in the sense of producing dividends year on year, which seem to be increasing, as alternative funding for this council and this council's work. I can't quite remember what sort of rates increase $50 million a year would equate to. It's about 4%, which is significant on top of the rates we have now. So this is a very important matter, and discussions about the future of the port need to take into account the reputation and the commercial viability of the port and the commercial security of the port as a company. And perhaps as politicians we're not so used to that sort of responsibility, but it is a very important and grave responsibility for us. So on one level it's precautionary to look to the future in an objective way and scope whether and how the future sea freight task of Auckland is managed. Another thing to be agitating for getting the port out of its present location so you can put high-rise apartment buildings in its place.
Who said that?
And what I am concerned about, Mr. Chairman, is that we have transparency and clarity in this particular process. Now, we had an address this morning from Mr. Shane Vuletich, who was a member of the Consensus Working Group, representing the Society for the Protection of Auckland Harbours. And I would sign up to that, and I'm sure all of us would as well. And some of us in particular supported the environmental aims of Stop Stealing Our Harbour. But in terms of this particular group, the Internal Affairs Charity Services rejected an application for charitable tax status on the following grounds. The Society's end goals include the beautification and improvement of public amenities and the protection of the environment. That's fine. The board considered both of these goals were capable of being charitable. However, the Society's end goals also included the economic development of the Auckland waterfront, which the board did not consider to be charitable. Now, I noticed this morning...
you, Councillor Lee, I want to... you need to explain how relevant that is to the motion.
Well, this morning we were addressed by Mr. Vuletich, but this time wearing the hat of Fresh Info. And Fresh Info is an economic and commercial advisory company, and one of its main clients is Auckland Council. So I think it's important that we have transparency about the interests of people who are advocating for moving the port. There is obviously a commercial economic motive behind Mr. Vuletich, which is over and above protecting the harbour. And I think members of the governing body need to know about that. In terms of relocating the port and the open-ended brief you're recommending to the Chief Executive, I have to say, in terms of value for money, which is an increasing consideration given the latest disclosures about our budget, that all of these alternatives have been investigated in the past. Leaving aside the logic of the Manukau and how the physical barrier of the Manukau bar can be overcome, the consultants say it can be. If that was the case, why is the port company retreating from a port at Onehunga on the Manukau? Perhaps we should be reversing that if there is a feasible way of creating an all-weather pathway through that Manukau bar. But I suspect that the Southern Ocean and the millions of tonnes of sand moving up and down that coast are a somewhat formidable barrier even now. However, and the other concern I have, Mr. Chairman, is the morality, if you like, of claiming that the Port of Auckland is damaging in its present location, but we can impose it on the people of Manukau, or we can impose it on the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park, which raises real questions about the Resource Management Act, its principles and purposes, and the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park Act. So in terms of this recommendation, Mr. Chairman, I'm deeply concerned that all the way through the report and all the way through the presentation, the officers claimed that at a certain stage, the Auckland Port in its present location will not be able to deal with the freight task of Auckland, without explaining that it will be able to deal with 3 times the present freight task. And I think the governing body, in making these sorts of decisions, needs clarity and objectivity in its advice. Coming back to my original point, we, as owners of the Port of Auckland, this major strategic and commercial asset owned by the people of Auckland, must be aware that continual questions about the certainty of the port in its present location and the enormous costs, billions of dollars, of building a new port is unsettling and undermining the commercial reputation and security of the ports of Auckland, which we are responsible for. And I think that is a task that we need to take very seriously indeed. I'm unhappy with the advice from the officers for the reasons I've pointed out, and I'm unhappy with the what I believe will be a complete waste of ratepayers' money investigating yet again the Manukau and the Firth of Thames, given the plainly obvious enormous costs of recreating a new port in a pristine environment. Mr. Chairman, the future freight task of Auckland, the future freight task of Auckland is absolutely reliant of Ports of Auckland staying where it is and staying within its present footprint, as the company has now rather belatedly agreed. But it will also need the inclusion of all the existing ports in New Zealand, especially Tauranga and Northport. And a much more sensible approach would be to scope ways and means of including surplus freight and sharing the container task and the cars, if you will, with Northport and with Tauranga, not removing the port, not destroying the value of the ports of Auckland. That would be totally irresponsible of the governing body of the Auckland Council. Thank you.
Member Tapari.
Kia ora, Mr. Chairman. I thought I'd say something so that we all had a turn and we could get to a vote. But simply this, you know, this is like been 5 minutes. This is the 3rd term of this council where this matter has been in front of the governing body, albeit different members from the 1st term to today. And we just seem to continue to delay the inevitable of having to look at the future of Auckland and its ports. And until you make a decision to actually do that, you can't instigate all the other things that you want to follow through with. And so you need to make the call. Why delay it? I don't get it. It's just going to continue to be like this every term until you actually make a decision to do something about it. Yeah. So I realise from a Māori perspective, there are implications that could be effective for the ancestral rights and the rights of the people that we certainly are here to advocate for, as well as all of Auckland. But to keep delaying that inevitable is crazy. So we're going to support those recommendations, and we're going to let the process continue on as it started years ago. And we need to get to the stage of realising those options and how valuable they are, or how constraining they are to the opportunities for Auckland to grow. So You know, again, you could go on and on and on like we have for the last 7 years. But the time has come to all the councillors to make a decision about the way forward here. And there's still a whole process that's been, you know, this is what about a process. This is not a fait accompli as someone might suggest today. So I say, and I encourage you all, you know, be strong about how you feel about things. But don't drag it back, don't hold it back. I mean, everyone needs to grow. And I say, and I encourage you all to support these recommendations.
Thank you, Member Taipari. Councillor Sayers?
Thank you, Mr Chair. And as enlightening and interesting and healthy as this debate has been, quite frankly, I think Auckland is far more concerned about Auckland Council controlling its wage bill and affordable housing than they are concerned about where a new port will eventually operate from. So, look, why are we spending more money on top of $1 million is the question I've been asking myself. What benefit is there going to be? And this is where the debate's been very helpful for me. So I thank everyone for their participation in that. For me, it's boiling down to the use of officers' time, and I appreciate your input today. But I just think Auckland has more pressing things, and it's really around the order of approach for me, because I think this report will be stale within a few months of it coming out because of the number of assumptions that we know have to be undertaken around it. And so those will change. It will be done again. And I just see that as a waste of ratepayers' money. Particularly the way around that was suggested by a number of councillors was to have central government involved with this up front, which we haven't. I feel that is probably the right approach, so they bear some of the costs and have some of the input into the strategic direction of this. So for me, it's just about the approach, Mr Chair. So thank you for my call.
Thank you. Members, I'm asking you, just as Member Taipari has asked you to support these motions, this has been before us a number of times. The previous council considered pretty much this report in July last year, and on a margin of 1, it was dismissed outright to the next council. The reasons then given were quite different to the reasons I'm hearing today. They're just new reasons, because resistance lasts in many, many forms. And I ask all the members to consider the evidence before you, not your anecdotal take away that might be brought to this table today, because I'm hearing some reasons that are not founded in evidence being conveyed here today, which were different to the reasons supporting your argument in opposing progressing things a year ago, July last year. I think the writing is, based on the evidence of this report, it's very clear the writing is on the wall for port relocation. The report is very clear in that regard, and yes, there is further work to do. I want to acknowledge firstly, and I should do this at the outset, I think it's some 17 members of the consensus building group, and they're made up of community, business, and they're made up of mana whenua. And this is one of the first times that we trusted, and remember, we signed off the scope. It was the former council that signed off the scope. And I'm not hearing any debate about that scope here today. We supported that scope entirely. In fact, that scope was refined by the consensus working group, and it came back here for us to check again, and we signed it off again. Not only once, twice. So what trust are we going to give now in this consensus building group, now that we finally receive and properly consider this report? Are we going to hold faith with that broad family of people, business, community, mana whenua, or are we going to just dismiss them outright and pretend that we don't have to address this part of Auckland's development? We have to address this part of Auckland's development. We can't ignore this. We cannot any longer continue to keep our heads firmly gripped in the sand on this issue. It's just not okay to keep doing that, to keep dismissing. The consensus working group, 17 members, chaired by Dr. Rick Boven. We chose that chair. That's the only person I think we chose, and the rest chose themselves, and we made sure that that group was diverse. Then a consortium was put together, led by EY. EY have a special unit to address cultural issues, EY Tahi. They participated. Black Key for planning, GHD for engineering, JLL for property, Oricon, transport planning, eCoast, environmental. They were in the mix. They were the experts bringing advice to the consensus building group. And I ask you to just heed all those inputs that have gone into this body of work when you consider their recommendations and whether you want to support their recommendations here today or ignore their recommendations and put us back to just square one, which I don't know where that might be. I agree that we need to go to government and advocate for an Upper North Island port strategy, but let's just look at the history as well. There has been no government that has ever wanted to take on a national port strategy, let alone a regional port strategy. No party has expressed that, though I think in recent campaigns, one or two parties have expressed an interest in an Upper North Island port strategy. But I don't want to get into the politics of that right now. We can continue advocating, but if we don't find a party in Wellington that is willing, where does that leave Auckland? Do we just go and put our head in the sand again? No, we need to progress this work. But let's go to Wellington one more time. Members, a lot of points have been raised here today about climate change and whether apartments are going to go on this land once it's vacated. That work has got to be worked up even further into the next body of work. Members, I think this is pretty clear that we do need to progress. I'm asking for your support for the next stage, which does not conclude on where the port will go and the timing. That is further work. A lot more work has to be undertaken, but I ask you, please, look at the horizon for Auckland. Look at our future. Have some vision for Auckland. Please look out for future generations. Please look out for the social well-being of Aucklanders that are going to follow us to these tables and be living in the city. The lead-in time to make changes on infrastructure like this are absolutely enormous. They are 20 and 30 years. We can kick this for touch and think it's not our responsibility. It is entirely our responsibility, and that direction is supported by a very comprehensive, well-founded consensus working group of recommendations. There are 4 key recommendations, and I'm asking you to back them and take this to the next stage, just the next stage. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In speaking to this agenda item, it's been really good to hear the passion from everyone. I mean, there is an issue that I think generates as much passion as the future of the Auckland port. And I think that there is a consensus around the table that we must be doing the long-term planning for the Port of Auckland. What is at stake here today, though, is have we got all of the facts and are we making the right decision? Because I think we've heard from Mr. Quinn and our officers, they're looking for a sense of strategic direction on the work that has already been undertaken. But what the problem for me is, you know, I don't want to see the ratepayers of Auckland writing a cheque for the rest of the North Island in understanding what the long-term needs of not just Auckland but for New Zealand are going to be. I'm disappointed that we are taking our decisions today in the absence of understanding, you know, what the makeup of the next government is going to be. So I'm going to move an amendment that we defer this agenda item until a government is formed, and I seek a seconder for that.
I'll second that.
Why, what's the difference?
So just I want to check whether I accept that as chair. So
Amendment, is it?
It's been moved and seconded.
that's fine. procedural amendment. I just want to check the standing orders.
One day.
No.
Excuse me, Mr Chairman, may I ask
Winston
a
could take
question of the
longer.
amendment mover?
Sorry, just a minute, please.
Why does it make a difference?
On the green.
Okay, I just want to check, please. Is it direct news?
I just don't want us to waste money. The government should be picking up on this.
See what number 80 says.
Can you clarify what the amendment is? By addition, by what?
I am proposing that this agenda item be deferred until a government is formed, so that the agenda item will come back to a subsequent planning committee when we have all of the information. The thinking that I have behind such an amendment is that I want to see such a study undertaken and taken to the next stage, but I do want central government to pick up the cost and some of the...
Okay, sorry, you're speaking to the amendment. I just want to clarify, it's an amendment by replacement, that's what I wanted to say.
It's an amendment by replacement.
Okay, it's an amendment by replacement, I'm going to accept it, and you're speaking to it. It's moved and seconded. You're speaking.
So my experience of life is that you actually get better decisions being made when you have all of the facts. And right at the moment, we don't have all of the facts. We don't know what government is going to be formed. We know that Winston Peters is, we know that Winston Peters has a strong view on this, and I don't think we should be put in the position of actually picking up and further work by officers, having officers go down a path when we actually don't know what the outcome is going to be in terms of the government. So I'm just asking colleagues to allow officers to have a much clearer sense, in a governance sense from us, once we know the makeup of the government, once we know the objectives of the government. Nobody, I think, in their right mind is going to dispute the need for looking at very long-term planning in terms of the future of the Port of Auckland. But what I have an issue with is, why does Auckland think it can go alone on this? Are we trying to find a strategy to determine something other than the Manukau, in the Manukau Bar, we know the problems with that. We know what the Firth of Thames, what the dredging, and what is entailed with that. I think most of us know if there's going to be alternatives, it will be outside of our jurisdiction at the moment. It will probably lie outside of the Auckland region. So to that end, I think that it would be prudent to wait, and I would ask, if we're taking a precautionary approach, as the Deputy Mayor is imploring us to do, and I'm not disputing that with him, all I'm saying is let's have all of the information available and then give that sense of direction that we are responsible for as members of this committee to our staff, and hopefully from there we can actually see progress being made. Thank you.
Members, I'll speak to this very briefly. I don't recommend that you support this motion. This is again just kicking it for touch. Waiting another 2 days. Today's Tuesday, there's a government formed on Thursday. What the priorities for that government might be, who would know? You can see that the recommendations that were on the board were to scope the task and look at the costs, and to go to government and seek their support. It basically said that, and this motion before you just says, it doesn't say about doing anything with government, it just says wait for a government to be formed. Well, fantastic. It'll be Thursday. I know that. A couple of parliamentarians have promised us that, so it's Thursday. I know the answer to this question. It's Thursday. Let's carry on. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. I mean, I can't support this. It doesn't matter whichever government we get. We need to be setting the agenda on this.
Yeah.
This is for our region. We can't be waiting till a favourable government comes into power. You could be waiting forever. We have to do this now. It's a matter of a couple of days, and I think we just have to be brave. And we know we need a port strategy. We've got to get in and really advocate strongly for that. I don't think we can be timid any longer. Thank you.
Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, speaking to this amendment, and I agree completely with Councillor Fletcher. If there's one thing we know that this council is time constrained and resource constrained. We don't have money to play with. And yes, we know that there's going to be a government formed shortly. But what we don't know is we don't know what that government is and what is going to be on the table around ports.
And neither will we know.
What we do know is that some parties have made promises, and those promises go to addressing the issue of ports in the North Island, and that's our port, Ports of Auckland, Northport and Tauranga. So it follows that it would be immensely prudent to actually defer this item so it comes back to us later. Immensely prudent for a number of reasons. One, it's not urgent for us to deal with this today. I'll repeat that, it's not urgent. Secondly, there are substantial sums of money involved and substantial staff and officer time and no doubt consultants as well. Thirdly, deferring this item generates some leverage on the future government, whatever that government is, and puts the ball back in their court, because quite properly, as a number of speakers have discussed, we should know what the possibility is around some rationalisation, some integration, some synergy within ports. So my conclusion is it's the sensible thing to do, it's the prudent thing to do, it's the right thing to do to vote for this motion on the part of Councillor Fletcher.
Councillor Sayers.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to speak in support of the amendment there. We do need to get the understanding of all the information. I agree with you, Councillor Fletcher, completely there. We won't know that until a new government's formed. It might take a little bit of time, actually, to find that from a new government. But without that political information that we need, and for me, particularly the buy-in, Mr. Chair, around the cost of going into the study, and the political buy-in to it, we've got to remember that this isn't a regional decision. This isn't an Auckland Council decision. This is an interregional decision. And then because of that, we must involve central government right from the start, not just engage with them as part of our own process. So I'm speaking in favour. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very briefly, and that's just to reiterate the fact that this time round the difference is in terms of the government is that ports and Auckland's port and Northport have been very much at the centre of the election campaign. So it's different from previous elections where they weren't mentioned at all. They have been this time, and it's conceivable that decisions or undertakings have been given or will be given that affect us. So in that respect, it does make sense just to wait to see what comes out of all of that. I guess secondly, this amendment addresses the concerns that were evident amongst some of the councillors who spoke, and that goes to the cost for this. You know, in the scheme of things, it's not a massive cost, but it is a cost, and if it's a cost we can do without, then why wouldn't you wait a little while, and waiting a little while, conceivably give haste to the people who should be leading that, as they did in New South Wales, where it was the government who led out on this, and then the state government came in behind once they had made their broader regional decisions. That should be the way that this rolls out. So we're giving an opportunity for that to happen. And I would suggest, Mr. Chair, that any approach to whatever government is formed will very, very quickly determine whether this is a reasonable assumption that we're making. If it's not, then clearly what you have said in your speech today then leaves us no option, because I don't think anyone around here is suggesting that we just sort of pretend that we don't need to address this in some way. But this amendment, I think, is quite pragmatic, takes into account a rather unusual political situation at the position, and also gives us a chance to actually step aside a little and allow the key player to be driving it, rather than us, the ones who are having to make all the moves for our rather limited viewpoint, which, let's be honest, doesn't address the wider issue.
Division.
Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. And look, I understand where Councillor Fletcher's coming from, because that was the question I asked right at the very beginning, exactly what is the role of the government. Having said that, I think we need to be leaders, not followers. This is our port, and it's what we want for this city. And I take on board that which Member Taiperi has said. And I think that whatever the government is, we should be the leader. We should say what our view is. If that doesn't work and we don't get there, well, so be it. But to wait and see who they are and let them lead this process, I don't think that's right. If you actually look at the recommendations, it talks about involving government every step of the way. The next stage has no cost other than staff time, which, according to the annual budget, could be quite considerable, but I digress. So there is no direct cost, and so why don't we just let them get on with the process, bring it back, and then see what we do from there. But if I look through the recommendations, and I'm sorry, I've only got the amendment up, so and they have, if you could just scroll back down, there is really nothing other than take this the next step, only cost is staff, work with government, whoever they may be, and they're going to be done in a couple of days, so they tell us, and let's get on with it. So I say, be a leader, not a follower, and pass the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. Councillor Hills.
Yes, I'll be opposing this. I think people would be pretty depressed watching our debate sometimes the last few weeks. We seem to get past things that are really important really quickly, and then over little things go on, and you know, we are either in control or we're not in control. But if the discussion around here is annoying, the discussion, the contempt for staff and opinion and advice and the work that's been done by some members, and some of the people who are now wanting this resolution were opposing the last resolution, so it comes ahead a month later and they'll oppose it anyway. I mean, so I don't know what difference it makes if what government we've got, the number one person talking about the port's going to be part of both governments, whatever it is anyway, and they're not going to send us a press release straight away saying this is what we want done with Auckland Port, by the way, now you can pass your resolution. And around this council we seem to get really peeved off if the government starts telling us what to do. So now we're saying the government should lead and we should follow and they should pay and we should do nothing. I mean, it's bizarre. So I don't think the original resolutions are saying or putting us down in concrete. They're just continuing the investigations long before I was around this table. So I'm opposing the amendment because it's just another month's delay and then we'll probably delay it again. You know, so we either vote for or against, and the government's involved, whoever they are. So,
Thank you. Councillor Cashmore.
Well, thanks, Mr Chair. And I can't support Councillor Fletcher's motion by replacement. The simple reason is, although Jacques and his team are pretty good, they'd be struggling to get this scoping work done in a week, let alone 2 days. So we need to focus on the reality is that we do need to front this, we do need to start it. The can has been kicked and dented down the road long enough. Councillor Simpson is right on the money when she says we need to lead and then partner up, because that's how you work with the Crown. If you wait, you will wait forever. If we can lead it forward, start this work, we can then get some motion with the Crown, although there has been resistance in the past. So I urge colleagues to support this as a proactive council, as a forward-moving council, and the council prepared to do its work thoroughly.
Thank you. I'm going to take the vote, and it's a division. Call the division.
Right, so voting on the amendment, Councillor Darby.
Against.
Councillor Casey.
Yes.
Councillor Cashmore.
No.
Councillor Coe.
No.
Councillor Collins.
For.
Councillor Cooper.
Against.
Councillor Fletcher.
For.
Member Taiperi.
Against.
Councillor Hills.
no, thank you.
Councillor Hulse.
No.
Councillor Mike Lee.
Aye.
Member Namani. Councillor Sayers.
For.
Councillor Simpson.
Against.
Councillor Stewart. For. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yes.
Councillor Watson.
For.
The motion has lost 8 votes to 9. I'll put the substantive motions
By division.
and take a division as requested.
Voting on the substantive motion, Councillor Darby.
For.
Councillor Casey.
No.
Councillor Cashmore.
Or
Councillor Clove.
For.
Councillor Collins.
against?
Councillor Cooper.
For.
Councillor Fletcher.
For.
Member Taipari.
Or
Councillor Hills.
For.
Councillor Hulse.
Aye.
Councillor Mike Lee.
No.
Member Namani. For. Councillor Sayers.
Against.
Councillor Simpson. For. Councillor Stewart. Against. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Against?
Councillor Watson.
No.
Thank you. Declare the motion carried, 10 votes to 7, and that concludes that item, and we'll adjourn for lunch until 1:30. Thank you, members.